Our next creation reading is going to be a more modern retelling of the story of Adam and Eve, at least the Genesis version, and that's going to come from Mark Twain and his Diaries of Adam, Eve, and Satan. Now, I should tell you that these were not published as a book until much later after his death. Instead, they were a series of articles that appeared in magazines. They were typically under the title of Letters from the Earth. And Mark Twain, maybe what we should kind of put up front early is as he got older, he became a little more bitter about things. Financially, he faced ruin. He had put a lot of money and investment into his own invention of a typesetting machine that failed miserably, taking most of his fortune with it. His beloved Livy, who was his wife for many, many years, passed away, and he never seemed to get over that loss. And in some ways, the story of Adam and Eve, the way he depicts it, is maybe an homage to his wife, and kind of the story that they maybe shared together. So what I want to look at first is that we're dealing with kind of a battle that's going on for Twain. Twain at the time, and we know from his writings that Twain was a big believer in science. He saw great promise in the things, the measurements, the technologies that were coming out in his age, and he was a big proponent of progress. But at the same time, Mark Twain was a very strict, he grew up as a strict Presbyterian, which meant that he had a very strict fundamentalist view of the Bible, at least he did in his early upbringing. And so for Mark Twain, he was a religious man, but he also loved science, and he found himself conflicted, particularly in this time period, because he was almost forced to choose one over the other, as the two institutions were battling each other out in things like the Scopes monkey trial, and other venues where you saw religion pitted on one side against science on the other. So Twain almost became obsessive with his view of looking at that and trying to fine-tune a way that he could reconcile a belief in Darwinian science and evolution and still adhere to his understanding of the Bible. So he became very fascinated with Genesis. And what he does is he takes the story of Adam and Eve and he satirizes it. And what he's trying to do through satire is bring attention to something that people aren't willing to talk about openly. And so for Mark Twain, the targets of satire are not simply religion, but also science as well. And you'll see that at work throughout this series of essays. So as we look at Adam and Eve, we'll notice that they make several mistakes. When you do your reading, you'll see that Adam is very proud at proclaiming himself as the first scientist. But at the same time, the theories he comes up with, like the law of fluidic precipitation, which is basically that water flows downhill, is completely silly. At one point, you'll hear Adam and Eve talking about how they have 9 children. Both of them, or half of them, are boys, the other half are girls. We wonder what the remaining child is. Adam talks about taking great pride in creating the times tables and how much time they take for him to do, and he wants to get it just right. And he proclaims proudly that 6 times 9 equals 27. And so what we have here is Twain making fun of this notion that science being true just because it's science is not necessarily the best approach that you should take. There's a starting point for things, particularly when we're naming and determining things like the times table. They become symbols, but we think of them as truths as well. So at times we can be blinded by obvious facts simply because we're human. And sometimes science can be myopic so that it can't see the forest because it's concentrating too much on the trees. Okay. So another thing you'll notice is that Adam's counting system is all wrong. But we need to question that. Is it wrong because we discovered it, not as it was originally established? Is the error on our parts is what the real problem is we tend to see science as being faultless and logic as being faultless rather than as being tools. Science must simply be correct because it's science. So I want you to think about particularly things like theories. that come and go. The idea that the earth is the center of the universe. The idea that Niels Bohr put forth for his model of what an atom looked like. All of these things get replaced as we get finer and sharper tools to examine phenomena. So who's to say that the things that we believe to be certain today may not be altered by future tools, by future scientists? But it's also fair to say that Twain equally satirizes religion as much as he does science. One of these things comes up humorously when he decides to populate his Eden with dinosaurs, and we see this nice little scene where Eve is wondering and Adam are wondering about how the dinosaurs are playing catch with the elephants, and you have this image in your head of this giant elephant being tossed about like a rag doll or like a ball between two giant dinosaurs. We also see Adam is very good at making fossils, and he chuckles to himself as he makes these fossils to plant into the ground as a trick, because he thinks he's playing a great trick on future mankind by burying these fake fossils. And this is alluding to the idea that became popular for a while, that the Earth was only 6,000 years old, and that dinosaurs were not either non-existent or dinosaurs were certainly along the same time as man. And so science has kind of shown that not to be the case. So you'll see Twain later in some of his essays, he'll outline his perception that for him, the problem with a lot of religion is that if we adhere too tightly to a strict interpretation of the Bible, we don't see that the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, was written by a very small group in a very small corner of the world. And so the God that inhabited that region was very different than the God that inhabits the world that Twain lived in or that we lived in. That God of Genesis was strictly proportioned to the dimensions that he inhabited. And so to have that God take on a personality like we see in Genesis doesn't seem to match the God that many people want to believe in. So the modern world's God needs to be one that accommodates and makes room for science. It seems to be what Twain's view is. Okay. As we look at this, I think the big summation we'll make from this discussion is, as you read Twain, understand that for Mark Twain, fundamentalism, a too strict interpretation of the Bible, was too narrow an approach, but evolution also was too narrow a tool to try to understand God. So you can't use science to understand God, and you can't use religion to understand science. Because of that, Twain felt like both of them were hardy targets for satire. Now, one thing I want to point out as you do your reading is I want you to pay attention to how Adam and Eve are depicted in these various stories. And you'll notice that Eve's diary is much longer than Adam's. She talks more. Adam comes across as kind of a grumpy old man, but they do grow to love one another. Even though he's bothered by Eve at first, he finds that he can't live without her. And Eve, as simple and as romantic as her notions are, she's got something that Adam lacks. And so the two of them, by the end of the tale, it's appropriate that they travel off together and that they age together. And I think what Twain is maybe hitting on there is a little bit of the romantic element, the idea that these two were meant to be together, and despite the bickering, despite the differences, they were in a sense kind of soulmates.